Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Painless and Scalable Compliance with AWS and VGS. This webinar comes off the heels of our announcement that VGS has been elevated to a select technology partner within the AWS Partner Network. We're excited to have two expert speakers presenting today. Our special guest from AWS, Lee Fox, a partner solutions architect at AWS focused on the partner program, and VGS's own David Scovetta, a senior compliance and security manager here at VGS. For today's webinar, Lee will be covering AWS's shared responsibility model and practice. Then we'll turn it over to David, who will cover how customers can use AWS and VGS in tandem to make achieving PCI and other compliances painless and cost-effective. Before we dive in, a few quick housekeeping items. All participants are in listen-only mode. This session is being recorded. We'll have time at the end for Q&A, so please submit your questions as we go via the chat. And finally, feel free to contact us with any further questions at bd@verygoodsecurity.com. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lee.
Thank you, Amanda. Hi, everybody. I'd love to be able to speak to you today about the AWS Shared Responsibility model and how it works in practice. Now, when we look at the shared responsibility model, this is typically the image that we see. It describes what does AWS, what are they responsible for the security of the cloud, the broad brushstrokes of the security teamwork, and the roles that they play in terms of the global hardware infrastructure, and what does the customer do for the security in the cloud, or locking down that last mile of security in terms of the workload that the customer is running. Perhaps a better way to describe this would be to use a metaphor of an office building. Now, in an office building, we have a management company, and that management company is typically responsible for a lot of the infrastructure of the building. The walls, are they there? Are they sound? Does everything inside the building actually work? For instance, do the elevators work? Are they functional? The broad security of the building too, the management company can handle. They can control who comes in and who comes out of each building. But what about for each of the different office suites that are in there? Not really able to control the specifics, but they can help. They can provide the doors and the locks. They can provide window latches, things that will enable the security tools for the security, if you will. The tenant themselves, they're responsible for the actual security of their own office suite. They'll have to set the entry and exit policies, decide who is able to walk in and out of the building. They're the ones who actually have to exercise the security and use the tools that are provided to turn the locks on the doors and to make sure that the windows are latched. Additionally, if there are any security concerns inside the building or inside the office suite, then they need to be responsible for that as well, because the building management does not know the specifics of all the different buildings that are different businesses that are running inside that structure. The best that it can do is provide the tools and maybe even a little bit of guidance, but the tenant has to be the one to actually enact that security. The same is going to be true with the AWS cloud and the shared responsibility model. AWS will take care of the physical security, will take care of the data centers and the networks, will make sure that all the services are in and of themselves are secured, but that they also provide the security means for people building solutions within the AWS infrastructure to secure them. But there's actually a lot more to it than just that. You see, AWS services can be broken up into three different categories. Infrastructure services, things where we provide the platform and the tools for solutions to be built. They're container services, and I'm not talking about things like Docker containers, although ECS, our managed container service, does fall within that category. What I'm talking about here are services that are managed services, things that we will provide all the undifferentiated heavy lifting for our customers. Typically, we see these as things like ECS, or the example that I'll talk about today is RDS, our relational database service. We also have abstract services where we take away even more of the responsibility and just leave the customer with the management of their own data. So to dive down into these a little bit deeper, we can see that this is what the infrastructure services category looks like. This is pretty much the same typical picture that we see everywhere we talk about the shared responsibility model, that slide that I showed you a short while ago. AWS takes responsibility for the global infrastructure, making sure that all the data centers are secure in and of themselves, make sure that all the availability zones are secure and that they are spaced out to handle their own disaster recovery. For instance, no two availability zones will be in the same floodplain. They will make sure that the networking is secure between the data centers, the availability zones, and the regions. AWS also makes sure that the services that we're providing are secure and compliant. But the customer themselves have to look at that final mile. They're building the solution, and anything that they build on top of that platform needs to be configured for the right security. Access via firewalls, making sure that OSs are updated, making sure the applications that are running are updated as well. So we look at the breakdown of responsibilities like this. AWS has 4 responsibilities on the left, those foundational services, the global infrastructure, making sure that there's the right identity access management, and that the API endpoints are all working. The customer takes everything from the data all the way down to where it touches the infrastructure. They're going to have to do all the operating system patches, all the application patches, all the networking, the software-based networking for building workload, the identity, the high availability, scaling needs, all the way down to the data protection. On the next side of this triumvirate, the container services, we're looking at services like RDS, our relational database service, where the customer is just asking for an instance of a database. All the undifferentiated heavy lifting behind that is done for them by AWS. So in this case, that line of demarcation moves up, but and AWS is now taking over the responsibilities for the platform and the application. We're taking over the responsibilities for the operating system that application is running on behind the scenes, in addition to everything that we had from the infrastructure side. Now, when we look at that line of demarcation, we can also look at it as a line of visibility as well. So the customer, since they no longer have concern over the operating system and the network configurations, the application, the patches, they don't see any of that information. It is abstracted away from them. And the AWS list of responsibilities has grown. We've taken on the operating system, we've taken on the platform, and those are some items that have disappeared from the customer responsibility because we've moved that line of demarcation closer to the customer. The last area that we would look at would be abstract services. And these are things that are best exemplified by our object storage service, S3. In this particular case, the customer in this case, the customer doesn't have any responsibility for the applications that they're running. From the customer side, there are no applications that they're running. In fact, they're just concerned about the data and the storage of the data. That line of demarcation has moved yet one more time closer to the customer. And we are taking care of the encryption as specified by the customer. We're taking care of the networked communication and the encryption of the data in transit as specified by the customer. The list of responsibilities has grown again for AWS, taking on the high availability, the data protection, as for all the areas that we are looking at. The customer has switched down to just the data protection and their own data. This will never change. Customers in AWS will always own and control their data, so that responsibility will continue to be there for them. Over time, we can see that as you shift from infrastructure services where you are building much of your application and your workload to container services and potentially over to abstract services where you're stitching together more managed services provided by AWS and utilizing things where AWS does the undifferentiated heavy lifting for you, then your responsibilities begin to shrink down. This is important when you start looking at something like security and compliance. AWS has a lot of compliancy controls that we are certified to. So ISO 27001, 27017, FedRAMP, ITAR, Cyber Essentials Plus, just to name a few. And while our services are compliant to these different specifications and requirements, it's a little bit of a misnomer where the thought is if you run your workload in AWS, it's automatically going to be secure and it's automatically going to be covered by these compliancies. It is not. Our services are covered by what we're doing. But since the shared responsibility model is core even with compliancy, in order to meet your certification objectives and your security objectives, all your accreditations, your certifications, your external audits, you will be able to rely upon what AWS has done. In fact, as far as compliancy goes, you can download our compliancy artifacts from a service called AWS Artifacts and use that as part of your own external audits. So with that as an overview for the AWS Shared Responsibility model, I would like to turn this over to David now, who will walk you through how VGS can help you with implementing the shared responsibility.
Great. Thank you, Lee. I really appreciate your time to go through that. We at VGS are an AWS customer. Let me also tell a little bit about myself. I am a senior program manager here at Very Good Security. I focus in security and compliance. And to Lee's point, we do heavily leverage a lot of the frameworks that AWS has put together when we are going through our own audits. But I'd like to take a step back and just kind of walk through an analogy that provides some context about how we, sitting on top of AWS, generally think about these things. So we care a great deal about our data, our clients, and our products, and we'll always be responsible to manage a component of that. So for example, and Lee was covering a bit of this, we're managing our own accounts. We are managing our own configurations. But when it comes to the underlying infrastructure and deeper layers, we are basically offsetting and minimizing that overhead. And that's not really surprising. We rely a great deal on outsourced options every day, but we do demand different mechanisms and levels of scrutiny to gain a level of comfort that's equal to the due care that we ourselves would want to provide. And the analogy that I'm promoting here is you're driving in a city and you want to park your car in a city garage. You generally want to know that the facility is secured. You want to know that your car is monitored, protected, that it's handled in a thoughtful manner, and you want to be able to access your car, your data, generally when you need to. And I think that's the general methodology that VGS is applying here. And for clients and customers, the general question being that if you can get to a state where you have comfort over the underlying layers that is protecting your core business, does it really need to be something you own? And I think one of the main differences here, and that's gaining a lot of traction and attention these days, is really focused on compliance, where if we're going to rely on custodianship for any parts of these, you and your auditors will generally demand a very strong validation of the security posturing you have in place. And compliance is basically how we achieve and how we demonstrate that comfort to other clients, to business partners, to stakeholders, to executives, management, and everyone up the chain. So that really leads into more of an overview of very good security. Our bread and butter is protecting sensitive information through a variety of different technologies focused on tokenization and data aliasing, with the mindset that no one really starts a company to get audited or to rack their own services. When you think about the underlying layers that Lee was really referring to earlier, customer data sitting at the top is really what keeps us working every day. It's often a subset of our product. Sometimes it is a core component of the core product. But when you think about the compliance frameworks that an organization generally has to go through to demonstrate to different partners, so for example, what the federal government may ask for will vary differently from what the Department of Education may ask for, from a small startup to a large banking or financial services organization. So if you look at the framework that AWS, for example, has in place, you have 20, 30 or more different frameworks, each of which are focusing on between tens and hundreds of different controls per framework. It's a lot of overhead that if compliance and running those operations isn't a core part of your business model, does make a lot of sense to consider bringing on for infrastructure services like AWS, or if you're focused on just securing your sensitive data, you need to use it or you want to use it as part of your day-to-day business operations, but you're looking to minimize the overhead and the liability, services like VGS can be a really outstanding option for you. And it really comes down to the point that most auditors may not care where your data actually sits. They just want to know it's protected. So, for example, if VGS was looking to build its own data center somewhere, auditors and business partners and new clients where we couldn't right now, we leverage AWS for these compliance reports, we would have to demonstrate an equal level of due care. So that may mean we are bringing on multiple compliance frameworks and we are building on multiple teams of auditors and we are going through the evidence process and the walkthroughs and the documentation and all of that. And it is a very significant burden, and I can only imagine what the Amazon audit and compliance teams go through on a daily basis. My hat's off to them. But to dive a little more into that, let's take a look at just one control. So PCI DSS has a control which asks for approving and testing all network connections and changes to the firewall and router configurations. Now, that's just one control of one framework, and there may be dozens of frameworks. So when you extrapolate that, it can mean hundreds of different controls. So there's testing guidance to examine how a client exactly has that employed, how has that control been designed for their unique environment, how effectively has that been executed on an ongoing basis, review of new technologies, different systems coming on board, if there are acquisitions. It really can be a very lively process that happens continuously. It's really very few of these frameworks are one-shot deals where it's a point in time and then you're like, cool, we're good for the year, see you next year. There's really a lot of overhead and ongoing monitoring. And when you think about time as a resource and the time that you have staff, including engineers and analysts, and maybe you have the CTO and other executives involved in all of these processes, that is often an unseen cost that's part of the overhead with a lot of these compliance efforts. So I think a better analogy is, while AWS is providing the core components of secured infrastructure, and people will still need to rely on managing certain things themselves, access and software configurations, software-based network and access, etc. VGS can apply similar methodologies for your sensitive data. And when we dive into what that really looks like, we have a variety of different technologies that can really provide a different number of options to clients based upon their business model and really what they're looking to get out of the service, while removing the sensitive data itself from scope from a number of different compliance frameworks, including most noticeably PCI, and allow the business to focus more so on what they originally got that business up and running to do in the first place, and really kind of focus more on building and growing and less time sitting in rooms with auditors. So if we dive a little bit into kind of how the platform works at more of a less high level, we provide you multiple methods to securely collect this sensitive data, and it's insulated from it ever having to touch your systems. This is focusing on collect, and this generally reroutes inbound traffic to VGS where it goes through the aliasing process. We then give you an aliased or tokenized version of your data, which can then be safely stored in your system or on VGS's system and used in the same way that the original data would be. So essentially, we're vaulting the original sensitive data in our secure environment and offloading the liability and reducing the likelihood of not only a breach, but we're also minimizing your compliance overhead where that sensitive data would otherwise be in scope. And similar to how VGS relies on AWS for their compliance reports, you can then rely on our PCI and SOC 2 and our general audit reports to provide a similar level of comfort to your auditors and your clients and your stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. We also offer a very unique service called Exchange, and this I admittedly don't see much in the industry. And this is a service function which allows sensitive data to be shared with any approved third party. And I generally see this more frequently in financial services and fintech organizations where they may have a duty to share certain financial data with downstream. They're either data brokers or data warehouses. They can be large firms like Visa, Experian. And this allows them to basically receive that data in an alias format while still making utility of it and allowing it to be passed on to the downstream systems. And we are essentially intercepting the network traffic that's originating downstream straight to those applications, more or less like a CDN. So if you kind of take a step back and you look at the different compliance components, I've been dealing with compliance and security for well over a decade now, and I find that thematically they are similar, while they do have different nuanced approaches and suite of controls and things. They generally focus on these core areas, and that is people, that is infrastructure, controls, documentation, planning, and maintenance. And maintenance, I would argue, is one of the most taxing components of that, because that's really where you, aside from just having your auditors come in once a quarter or once a year, you are continually managing to self-assert that you have certain controls in place. So there's definitely a lot of value in considering an outsourced option and protecting your sensitive data with VGS, just as we rely on AWS to provide the nuts and bolts and secure configuration options that AWS affords. And there will always be that shared responsibility where AWS and VGS is really providing the bulk and the core components, and you can rely on those compliance reports to demonstrate that level of comfort, while there is still a modest amount of work that stays with the system owner to generally design the things that are on them that same way. So, and there are quite a number of different cost-effective approaches with VGS. When you look at how taxing and costly it can be to kind of go it on your own over the long term, those numbers do add up. So with the cost of VGS, it is a substantial comparison to the overhead, and including that time resource component. So like one thing I generally do anytime I'm in an audit, and I'm thinking about the long-term costs and maintenance and what it really costs us to do an audit, the people that you have sitting in the room, the people that you have responding to their auditors, what is their time worth? And that is a big reason that I personally love solutions like this. So that said, I've talked through quite a bit. I've covered quite a number of topics. I'm sure there are a couple of questions. Is there anything that I can answer for anyone, or that Lee can?
Great. Thank you, David, and thank you, Lee. Our first question that was submitted is, how will the shared responsibility model evolve over time?
Oh, sure, I can handle that. The shared responsibility model over time. Well, the first thing that I need to point out is that AWS listens to our customers and provides the services that we offer at their request. We also pay very, very close attention to the problems that customers are experiencing, and then try to also invent solutions for those problems on their behalf. So if we look at where we are now in terms of the shared responsibility model and how we went from just infrastructure services to having container services and abstract services, it was really a combination of two things. It was a combination of those customer requests that came in and how we responded to them, as well as the technologies that became available at any given time. So as we look forward towards the future, the shared responsibility model will evolve to handle those two areas, which are admittedly hard to nail down what things will look like 5, 10, or 15 years in the future. What I can say, though, is that when we looked at how that line of demarcation went between AWS security of the cloud and security in the cloud, how it moved up, it stopped at the abstract services right at the customer data. It won't go any higher than that, because AWS customers will always own their data. They own and control their data. It is up to the customers to decide who has access to it using any of the access controls that we provide, any of the identity and access management that we provide. The customer decides where that data resides in a given geographical region or in a given service. AWS does not make any claims or take any ownership. We do not make any decisions about any of the issues regarding customer data. It always belongs to them. Therefore, that line of demarcation won't go any higher than that.
So just to follow up with my own opinion, I would definitely see a lot of the same. And I would see more service partners like AWS making it easier for their clients to maintain their component of the shared responsibility model. So for example, there's AWS Guard Duty, Inspector, CloudTrail, CloudWatch, making it easier for organizations to maintain a compliant environment for the controls that they ultimately own. And it's really exciting to see what I've seen over the last couple of years and to think about how that'll grow in the future.
Great, thank you both. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in and thank you to Lee and David. Again, if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us at bd@verygoodsecurity.com.